Hello, welcome to Grade 10 English. This is Mr. D. Today we'll be talking about the elements of a story, at least insofar as they're going to be affecting us over the semester to come. Now I have an acronym that I'd like to share with you here. An acronym is a word made up of smaller words. In this case, the acronym that I've created is pastry. It's not the kind of pastry that you can eat, but it actually is a word that represents all of the different elements that we'll be talking about over the next few weeks. The P in the word pastry stands for protagonist. The protagonist is the hero of the story. That's the character that we want to follow. We root for them. We hope that they overcome all of the obstacles and that ultimately they come out the other end of the story successful. The A in the word pastry is for antagonist. The antagonist is that character or that element that the hero has to fight against or work against in order to successfully complete the story. So now the antagonist often is a character. Take, for instance, the story of Little Red Riding Hood, where Little Red Riding Hood is going through the woods and she comes into contact with the antagonist, the big bad wolf. And so it's the struggle between these two characters that we're seeing through the rest of the story, and we're hoping that she'll overcome the wolf and somehow manage to get through safely on the other end. Meanwhile, the antagonist is there to make the story interesting and to give the hero something that challenges them. The S in the word pastry is for situation. The situation, or if you will, the setting is really what sort of creates the context of the story. We need to figure out where the story is happening, when the story is happening, and just generally what the situation is, so that we've got a place to start from. Not all stories start necessarily in the beginning. Sometimes the situation that we're in is a little further along in the development, and it really kind of depends. So I don't want to call that necessarily the starting point, but it's the situation that we start with. It's the context. The T in the word pastry, I put a couple of them here. That stands for the trials that the protagonist is going to face. Because when a protagonist goes through a story, one of the things that happens is that they change over the course of time. So they start off the story one way, and by the end of the story, they become different somehow. Usually better, not always, but usually better. And they can face any number of trials. I created 3 here just to put on my little arc, so that way we'll be able to talk about them a little more in a moment. But think of these basically as the bumps in the road that are going to slow our protagonist down. Because it's true that in life, generally what we like is we like going straight from point A to point B. You don't want to think about leaving for school in the morning and on the way having to deal with a wicked witch or a big bad wolf or anything like that. Those things generally don't happen, but I mean, life is sometimes full of surprises. We generally like things to be easy, but not in our stories. We like our characters, our protagonists in our stories, to deal with some sort of adversity, to deal with trials. And those trials really help to make the character interesting and also ultimately make the resolution of the story more worthwhile. So we've got some trials here. The R in the word pastry stands for resolution. And resolution, in the sense that we're using it here, is talking about the solution to whatever problem it is we started with. So we want to start with a situation here that's interesting, that's challenging somehow for the protagonist. Through the course of the trials that the protagonist is going to face, we finally come to a resolution. Now, sometimes that resolution is going to be a happy one. Sometimes it's going to be a tragic one, and it depends on what kind of story we're telling. I know most of us prefer our protagonists to have everything work out in the end, but it doesn't always come out that way. So there's our resolution. And then the Y in pastry is you. And that's because all of these different elements come together to make a story that someone has to read or someone has to listen to. And that's generally the reader. So if you're listening to a story, you're going to listen to the the context, the situation at the beginning. You're going to follow the trail or the path of the protagonist as he or she passes through each of these trials, ultimately coming to a resolution, and then probably there's a reaction that the reader generally has, and it might be a reaction like, "Wow, oh, that was an exciting story, and I'm really happy that Sherlock Holmes solved the case," or "Wow, I can't believe that Romeo and Juliet don't make it in the end." Sorry for the spoiler. The Y stands for you, and we'll come back to that in a few moments, but what I want to do here is just sort of give you an example. So I'm going to walk you through a story that many of you already know, and we'll see how those elements work together in order to make the pastry arc that I have in front of you here. So first of all, what I'm going to do is let's tell the story of Hansel and Gretel, in a manner of speaking. So Hansel and Gretel is the story of a little boy and a little girl, brother and sister. They live with their father and their stepmother on the edge of a deep, dark wood, and they realize, or at least someone in the family realizes, probably the stepmother, that there's simply not enough food to go around. And that the best thing to do under the circumstances is to trick the children to go off into the woods in order that they may starve to death and the father and stepmother might live a little bit longer. Now, depending on which version of the story you've read or heard, the stepmother is either entirely evil or the father is maybe a little evil too, kind of depends. But let's just put our protagonists, Hansel and Gretel, out in the woods. Okay, now Hansel and Gretel are going to have to struggle with a number of things here, but what I think we're going to try to do is we're going to right away introduce our antagonist, even though she doesn't come into the story for a little while yet. Those of you who know the story of Hansel and Gretel, you know that Hansel and Gretel wind up lost in the woods. They're starving, they're hungry, they need something to eat, and they wind up eating the witch's cottage, which in our version of the story is going to be made of pastry. Huh, get it? Okay. So the witch is going to be our antagonist. She's going to be the other character that the protagonists have to work against. So let's have a look here. Now, our situation, our protagonists are lost in the woods. And they face a number of trials being lost in the woods. The first of which is, beyond just being lost, that they're very hungry. They have no food. They probably haven't eaten a regular meal in a long time. What they would love is to stumble across a McDonald's with a Big Mac and fries, but that's not going to happen out here in the deep, dark woods. What happens instead is that they come across the witch's cottage. It's made of pastry. They're starving. They eat some, even though they shouldn't, and she takes them prisoner. So now they wind up finding themselves here, both hungry, imprisoned by an evil witch in the middle of the deep, dark woods. Honestly, I'm not sure how evil she is at the beginning. Yes, she does want to eat one of them, but when you think about it, they did eat her cottage. And I can only imagine what the renovation costs would be on a cottage made of pastry, but that's for another day. So they need to somehow outwit the witch. Say that 5 times fast. Now, if they can outwit the witch, they will manage to survive this sort of final trial, or this super trial, and from there they'll be able to do what hopefully they will do, which is to return home. And hopefully when they return home, it's going to be a little bit better. Now, there are a lot of different versions of this story, and you've probably heard some different versions of the story. We're just going to sort of stick with my simplified one for the moment. So let's just review here. We've got a situation. Hansel and Gretel, brother and sister, lost in the woods, so hungry, eating the witch's cottage. They wind up becoming her prisoners because they made her mad. They wind up in a situation where one of them is going to be turned into a slave and the other one is going to be turned into some sort of goulash. And so really their only choice here is to outwit the witch, or they're not going to make it at all. They succeed in outwitting the witch. If you don't know how that happens, I won't spoil it for you right now. Go and read it. And they find their way back home, where hopefully there's going to be a little more food and a little less neglect. So that's our story. Now, you, or the reader, is an important element in this story, because all of those different things, might mean something different to a different reader. If I sit down and read the story of Hansel and Gretel, I might look at it and think, wow, those are terrible parents, because I happen to be a parent, and some part of me believes that I'm qualified to judge whether or not they are terrible parents. Uh, a toddler who's hearing this story for the first time, first of all, is probably going to be terrified by the idea that they're sent out into the woods by themselves, but then is going to really relate to, wow, if I saw a cottage that was made of pastry, you know, I might have a bite too. And then to find out that they're going to become prisoners of the witch, and they're going to have to outwit her and then trick her into her own fire. All of that's hilarious. And so that's very satisfying. They're going to take something different away from the story. And so that's why one of the important elements is always the reader. And even though that's not something that the person writing the story or creating the story can count on, it's an element that we have to take into account. And we're definitely going to be taking it into account over the course of this semester, because as you do your pastry journal entries, I'm going to be asking you to identify the protagonist or protagonists, the antagonist or the antagonists, the situation of the story, some of the trials, and finally the resolution. But then what I really want to know is what you took away from the story, because that is the most important element of all.